You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 29th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and a warm welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio 2 here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, Europe's E3 group holds talks with Iran, with plenty to talk about, including the imminent Trump presidency and the prospect of reopening talks on a nuclear deal. But is Tehran interested in hearing what Europe has to say? Also coming up, Donald Trump says he's enjoyed a wonderful phone call with the Mexican president, but will it be good enough to stop him hitting the country with 25% tariffs? We'll hear more about the arrest of a leading Ugandan opposition leader, and then how one homegrown film is beating all the Hollywood big hitters in Brazil. All that coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. Just how relevant is Europe's voice to Iran? Representatives of the E3, France, Germany and the UK, are meeting officials from Tehran in Geneva today. They're talking about talks, whether there is scope to defuse tensions in the Middle East, including Tehran's nuclear programme, and what to do about the return of Donald Trump to the White House. But in the current geopolitical climate, questions are being asked about the strength of Europe's voice and its powers of persuasion. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Ruth Michelson, who's a journalist and Middle East correspondent, and Paul Rogers, Open Democracy's international security expert. A very warm welcome back to you both.
Hello.
Paul, could you just explain to us to begin with, do we have any more details about what they're actually talking about?
No, it's pretty tentative. I mean, the basic thing is that the E3, the European states, want to try and get to a position where it may be possible to have negotiations with Iran once Trump gets in. They really want to probe what the Iranian position is. The Iranians obviously aren't following clearly and fully the 2015 treaty, from their view, because basically Trump withdrew the United States from it in 2018. Why should they? And they have been steadily enriching uranium to a higher grade. The basic problem here is they've got to have enough uranium-235, the really potent part of it, to enrich to about 90% of purity, which is a very long process. They've gone up to 60% for some of their stock, and it's relatively easy to go further, but there's no inclination to do that. So for the moment, things are narrowly poised. What the Europeans, I think, want to avoid is such a breakdown in communications between the Iranians and the incoming Trump administration that the Iranians just go hell for leather and try and get at least a crude device to show they can do it. That's not likely in the short term, but it could be likely in the longer term if things go wrong. And you've always got to remember that part of this depends on the relationship between Israel and the United States, as well as the position in relation to Iran.
Ruth, how much of a point has Paul got here that we have no inclination to avoid a breakdown of communications between Trump and Iran? I mean, is anybody really listening to Europe's voice in this?
Well, I mean, the Iranian foreign minister, who's on a visit to Portugal at the moment, said of these talks, "I'm not optimistic about this visit, these talks, because I'm not sure if Iran is talking to the right side." So, I mean, Paul's really got a point here that, the bigger question, the elephant in the room, if you want to call it that, is the incoming Trump administration. And both the Iranians and all of the European parties already know that Trump is going to fill his cabinet with Iran hawks, obviously the figure of Marco Rubio looming pretty large here, and that these are some people that are going to be in the driving seat come the end of January for the Americans. And so the Iranians, from their perspective, they're obviously willing to talk to the Europeans. But I mean, you said it yourself at the beginning. This is a talk about talks. This is a meeting and a discussion to see if these parties can look at what's happening across the Middle East, across the wider region, thinking about what's happening, the increasing escalations between Israel and Iran directly for the first time, and all of this with the idea that the incoming Trump administration is extremely likely to just inflame this situation, that Trump is probably going to give the Israelis carte blanche to do whatever they want. There's going to be not even minimal pushback from Washington. And so there is, even though these are talks about talks, there's a lot of, each side has an interest in at least having a line of communication that could be beneficial, that they can maintain before Trump gets in.
What can Europe offer from this, Paul? I mean, what Ruth has just talked about was, offering this line of communication. But at the same time, when you have Iran knowing full well what might be lying around the corner when it comes to a Trump administration, is it beneficial to have the ear of Europe here?
It probably is, but one shouldn't overestimate this. The Europeans in this position, both the EU as a whole and, of course, the E3, the UK doesn't involve itself in the EU negotiations. Essentially, it's useful in one sense. Look at it from the Iranian point of view. Masoud Pezeshkian, the new president who's come in fairly recently, has a major internal problem of Iranian dissent, and he would certainly like to be in a position where relations with the West improve, particularly on the relationship to sanctions, because they are affecting the country quite a lot. So to that extent, I think the Iranians recognize that there may be some value in dealing with the E3, because at least there may be an opening there. And of course, what is pretty clear is that the E3, the European side of the whole thing, do want better relations with Iran, because of course, what they do not want is any kind of explosion, political or actual, which starts sending oil and gas prices up. One always has to remember that these days is not something which worries the Americans so much, because with all the fracking they've been doing, they're producing so much more oil and gas at home. And that, I think, is one of the factors we rather tend to forget. And it's why the Europeans really want to, I think in some ways there's a slight term of desperation on the European side to at least have some channels more open. They don't really expect to get anywhere over the next couple of days, but at least it is a start, and maybe something will develop in the short term, maybe in through to January the 20th. It's January the 20th, of course, is the big day, because that is when Trump comes in. And you just can't predict what will happen then, I'm afraid, given the nature of his administration. And as Ruth said, we're getting some really hard-line people like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is very anti-Iran.
From the point of view, from just listening to all this, there is that fear that the European Union or Europe as a whole doesn't have the voice that it would want, but it still tries to exert some sort of influence and some sort of responsibility. I think it was just a little bit, I think it was last week that the E3 pushed ahead with a resolution against Iran, trying to get the UN atomic watchdog to prepare a comprehensive report on Iran's nuclear activities by spring next year. Ruth, just asking you about this and the nuclear program in Iran, is there any sense that something or someone might be able to sort of put the brakes on here?
Well, I mean, Paul made a fair point there that one of the main impediments to what the Iranians are trying to do in response is time. And so, in the gap between what the Iranians ramping up their nuclear capacity and actually achieving the ability to develop a weapon or to do something more dramatic in response. I mean, we saw in response to what you were saying that, the Iranians have responded to that censure motion by saying that they're going to speed up their nuclear program. But that doesn't mean that by January the 20th that everything will be in place to make something happen. And so what is happening what's happening as a result now is that there is a window in which there is the possibility for some diplomacy. I mean, we saw the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, in a visit to Iran a few weeks ago, talking about how there is this small window, and he said literally space for negotiation and diplomacy is getting smaller. And that's really what today is, that there is, there's this opportunity to keep these lines of communication open, have some talks. That is the opportunity at the moment. And the time between Iran saying that they're going to do something and actually achieving it, that is the only opportunity that these European countries have to influence the situation, is to intervene, to make a case for some form of diplomacy, even if what it results in is what we're seeing today, which is this rather sort of nebulous talks about talks, keeping the lines of communication open in advance of this looming dramatic change in January.
Ruth Michelson and Paul Rogers, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 10 minutes past midday. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at today's other news headlines. Here's Anita Riotta.
Thanks, Emma. Thousands of Georgians took to the country's parliament last night, protesting Georgia's halt to European Union accession talks until 2028. The announcement comes hours after the European Parliament adopted a resolution condemning the October 26th election, citing major irregularities leading to neither free nor fair elections. Volkswagen workers are set to strike in Germany from Sunday. Like several other European car manufacturers, Volkswagen is dealing with intensifying competition from Chinese rivals. Volkswagen has demanded a 10% wage cut, arguing it needs to slash costs and boost profit to defend market share. After more than 5 years of reconstruction work, Notre Dame Cathedral is unveiling its new self to the world. The occasion is being marked by French President Emmanuel Macron, who is making his final visit to the construction site ahead of the iconic monument's reopening for worship on December 8th. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Anita. Now, Uganda's opposition politician Kizza Besigye has appeared in court a week after being arrested in Kenya and brought back home to his home country. He faces a variety of charges, including possessing weapons. Human rights campaigners claim his detention last week at a book launch amounts to kidnapping. Well, Phil Clark is Professor of International Politics at SOAS, University of London. He joins me on the line now. Welcome back, Phil.
Thanks, Emma.
Good afternoon to you. Just explain to us, could you just recap what's happened?
So just over a week ago, Kizza Besigye had gone to Nairobi in Kenya to attend a book launch. And in the time of that event, he was arrested by the Kenyan authorities who had been colluding with Ugandan authorities, and Besigye was then extradited to Uganda. He's been in jail over the last week, and then he's appearing in a military court today. The sense in Uganda broadly, I think, is one of outrage that this very prominent opposition politician, who in many respects had started to leave the political terrain, has been arrested, is being charged with what many people think are trumped-up charges. It's an attempt to try to muzzle this very prominent opposition figure that he's being made an example of. And as a civilian, he's now being prosecuted in a military court, which really goes against Ugandan law. So this is the biggest story in Ugandan politics for this year.
His wife and indeed many human rights campaigners are saying that the fact that he was arrested in Kenya and then brought back to Uganda is tantamount to kidnapping.
Indeed, and it seems to go against the extradition treaty between the two states. There's a suggestion in Uganda that the Kenyan authorities had colluded with the Ugandan authorities on this, that there'd been a long-standing plan. The Kenyans knew that Besigye was coming to Nairobi for this particular event, and so the Kenyans are staying very quiet on this. They're trying to frame it as entirely a Ugandan problem, but it does seem that there was some coordination, some underhanded coordination between the two governments to get Besigye back to Kampala for prosecution.
Why have they decided to prosecute him now?
It's very peculiar in some senses, Emma, because Besigye is no longer the leader of Forum for Democratic Change, one of the major opposition parties in the country. If anything, he's been out of the limelight for the last 2 or 3 years, and opposition candidates like Bobby Wine have started to gain much greater prominence. But I think this is really about the Ugandan government having an eye on the 2026 presidential election. So it's just over a year away. They're using Besigye, I think, in a slightly weaker time of his political life, to nevertheless make an example of him, sending a message to Bobi Wine's supporters, to any other potential threats to Museveni's presidency, that if you stick your neck out and try to run against Museveni in 2026, you could suffer the same kind of fate as Besigye. Now, normally this kind of political intimidation in Uganda happens 3 or 4 months out from an election. This is probably the 5th or 6th time, in fact, that Besigye has been in jail. But I think this shows that the Ugandan government is starting this kind of repression a lot further out from the election. It maybe suggests that they're particularly worried about various opposition threats. The government doesn't feel as impregnable now as it perhaps did in the past, and so the repression is starting much earlier than we've seen with previous elections. But there's no question that Besigye is being used as a kind of a political symbol and an example with this arrest over the last week.
Will he be able to get himself out of this, or are we just likely to see him disappear for the foreseeable until the elections are out of the way?
I think he probably will get out of this. He's proven to be quite legally adept in the past. And as I said, he's been arrested numerous times previously. And he's got a really excellent legal team who, unfortunately, are quite accustomed to having to bust him out of jail and try to get these kind of trumped up charges off his back. So my sense is that he probably legally will survive this case. Also, he's so high profile and there's so much international attention on Uganda over this case that I think the Ugandan government dare not disappear him or do anything else, violent or underhanded towards him. I think from the Ugandan government's point of view, it was enough to be able to kidnap him and bring him from Kenya and put him in the dock in a military court. That is the kind of message that the government wants to send to the opposition forces. They probably feel that their job is done. My guess is we probably will see Besigye released in the next week or two, but nevertheless, a huge amount of reputational damage has been done to the Ugandan government via these actions in the last week or so.
Phil Clark, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were The Briefing. The US President-elect Donald Trump claims he's enjoyed a wonderful telephone call with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum. The conversation is the first one that Trump has said first since Mr. Trump said that on day one of his presidency, a 25% tariff will be imposed on all imports from Mexico, in an apparent easing of the tensions raised this week over tariffs. Well, Chris Sabatini is Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, and he joins me again. Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon, Ellen.
So what does wonderful mean?
Wonderful means basically Trump feels that he got what he wanted. It was, there's a lot of bluster here. This is a man who fancies himself one of the great negotiators. And so, what he's doing was rattling the saber, claiming that slap 25% tariffs on all goods for things that really aren't trade related, migration, and the fentanyl crisis in the United States. So basically what he wanted to do was rattle Sheinbaum a little bit, and she talked to him and she promised to stop a migrant caravan that was of about 800 people that was passing through Mexico. And she pointed some of the blame at the United States, too. It's a consumption problem in the United States, not so much a supply problem, but then also pointed the finger at U.S. gun laws, or the lack thereof almost, that supply a lot of the violence in Mexico. And I think he was able to walk away and feel that he had made a point. And she could walk away and say, well, she didn't agree to close the border, which is he claimed. It's a 2,000-mile border, so that's effectively impossible. But, for his constituents, it made him look tough. Made him look like he's following through on what he wants to do. But it also demonstrated that Mexico, in many cases, has more leverage in this than many people believe.
What leverage do they have here?
Well, first of all, it's true, while they can't seal off the border, they can stop these large caravans. They also have been repatriating a number of the undocumented immigrants. The U.S. sends them to Mexico, and then Mexico dispatches them. That is, the U.S. government's paying a lot of money for the Mexican government to do that, actually. But also there's a trade issue. It's the U.S. and Mexico's trade relationship is deeply intertwined. Mexico is the largest export market now for the United States. It surpassed China just this year. Automobiles that are made or sold in the United States are actually assembled from different parts and cross the border several times the U.S.-Mexico border. And then the last Trump administration, the Mexican government very wisely targeted specific sanctions in specific congressional districts that affected products made in those congressional districts to put pressure on Trump. And so, in that case too, they have some leverage on this. Again, it's the largest export partner for the United States. If they were to impose tariffs, basically U.S. manufacturer would feel the pinch.
I mean, is the leverage that Mexico has that you've just laid out there enough to stop tariffs of 25%? I mean, neither side clarified the status of the tariffs following the phone call. I think Sheinbaum said that the pair of them didn't discuss tariffs. But this would be something that would be incredibly damaging for Mexico. Mexico would hurt more, wouldn't it?
It would. Basically, about almost 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. It would be terribly damaged. And also very important sectors in manufacturing, not just agriculture, manufacturing, even chip technology. It has imperfectly, under the last administration, tried to pitch itself as a source for nearshoring to the U.S. market. It would be severely hurt. But again, there are American manufacturers that often in those cases are on the Mexican border, as well as Canadian and others. But, Ford Motor Companies and others have manufacturing plants in Mexico. So it's not like they're Mexican companies. Yes, Mexican workers would be hurt, but American companies would be hurt as well because of their investments in Mexico.
Chris Sabatini, thank you so much for joining me on Monocle Radio. You were the briefing. Let's hear now about the structural engineer Hanif Kara, the winner of this year's Soane Medal. The prestigious award recognises people who've made a significant contribution to the field of architecture. Well, Hanif's acclaimed projects include Bloomberg's European headquarters in London and other notable projects including Google London's headquarters and the new London Museum soon to open in Smithfield. Well, whilst in London to deliver the annual Soane Medal lecture this week, Hanif joined Monocle's design editor Nic Monisse here at Midori House to talk about the significance of an engineer winning a top architecture award for the first time.
I was surprised and shocked that they had considered it, but equally really pleased that they're far more open-minded than engineers are in the breadth of thinking, given the current state of the world in the many crises and on top of that, the climate, that our focus in engineering is too narrow, but for the Soane to pick somebody like me was like drawing in the world and saying, this is a bigger problem and let's speak to many others and give an award to somebody who's trying to do that. My institution congratulated me, and that's the first time in 40 years, ever. Despite the fact I have an OB and many other awards, this is the first time I've heard from them, which tells me something, to say, well, you should have been awake, because I think that people like the Soane Museum are in touch with what's going on in the world and have been for centuries. But when you go back to Soane, back to 1757 and what the architects were doing, then you suddenly pick up on the bigger mark that architecture and landscape leaves. Engineers are just enablers for all of that. And I think we haven't caught on to the fact that now we have to lead because of the climate and we have to drive a lot of this kind of work. The Soane was I think, smart jury moment when they picked me. I'm told yesterday that it was unanimous and very quick, which is nice. There was a gathering of generations in the jury that thought I was the right person, and it's been amazing.
That's fascinating to hear. They said that, to pick an engineer, but you've also talked about the role of the engineer there. I mean, you're saying it needs to change. It needs to stop being about the background, but you also need to be leaders. We do. I think, my colleagues might say that we already are, but I think we're silent about it. And now you can't, with the problem of, in particular, the climate crisis, I think we have to come to the front of the discussion. We've already started in the last 20 years to make a difference. The crisis isn't as bad as it could have been already. And if we can come further forward by changing the way energy works, or changing the way embodied energy works in buildings, changing the materials we use, I think rather than responding and solving problems, we're actually initiating ways of thinking for architects and everybody else in industry, including builders,
So we can do that as engineers, and why shouldn't we speak out? Historically, we've just waited until everybody said something, and then we do the numbers and make it stand up, and that's it. It's a binary way, scientists, whereas now that single disciplinary approach to the current crisis of the world ain't going to work. We're going to have to forget the disciplines and find the bigger solutions, transdisciplinary solutions.
That's something that's quite fascinating to me, this idea of the disciplines. I mean, you talk about structural engineers being around for 200 years. The reality is these are all kind of new concepts.
Yes.
I'm going to throw something a little bit rogue. I want to go back to Vitruvius, who I've been thinking about a little bit. But, he talked about strength, utility and beauty.
Yes.
He was an architect, but the concept of the architect didn't even exist at the time. Yeah. These were people that make the world that we live in. Yet somehow it feels like we're kind of siloing things. People were responsible for strength, people were responsible for utility, and other people were responsible for beauty.
Yeah.
Is it shifting now to come back to all three working together?
I think it hasn't, and it isn't fast enough. I think that separation is what caused many of our problems, and I think it has to shift back. It's kind of being Renaissance man if you talk about let's go all the way back and be builder, developer, everything else. But part of the loss of that whole game, and Vitruvius in particular, to assume an engineer doesn't think of beauty is ludicrous. You might not want to share your taste, that's a different thing. But we think of beauty as well, but it's been separated and specialized in so many little fragments. You don't have to go backward and use spades to do it. You can use the new technologies that we've got available to unite, find a new framework to unite for a better world. And I think that's a role that engineers should now take up in collaboration with other people.
And that was the prize-winning structural engineer Hanif Kara talking to our design editor Nic Monisse. And we head to Brazil finally, where a local title is dominating the cinema box office, beating the likes of Wicked and Gladiator 2. The film in question is called I'm Still Here. It's the latest Wouter Salles film, and it's a touching movie telling the story of Eunice Paiva, a mother and activist searching for her missing husband Rubens Paiva during the country's military dictatorship period. To tell us more, Monocle senior correspondent Fernanda Augusto Pacheco joins me once again in the studio.
Always a pleasure, Emma. I'm back after yesterday's lovely global countdown.
Indeed, I'm still recovering, frankly. We're still playing Pump It Up. If you haven't heard it, ladies and gentlemen, all Monocle Radio programmes are available as a podcast. I'm Still Here. An enormous film that's absolutely sweeping the boards in Brazil. Tell us all about it.
I had the pleasure to watch a screening here in London. And what a surprise, Emma, because this is doing so well at the box office. But let's remember, it's a drama. It's the story, as you mentioned, of Eunice Paiva. She was a mother and activist. Her husband was a former MP before the Brazilian military dictatorship. And suddenly he gone missing during this period. So it's a really kind of at times quite heavy story, but when you look at the film, and that's the beauty of Wouter Salles, it starts very sunny. It's the life of a middle-class family living in Rio de Janeiro. It's beautiful, sunny, people playing volleyball on the beach, and suddenly it turns after about 45 minutes. Oh my God, I even have goosebumps here. It's a story that is very close to Brazilians. And I'm so proud that this film has been topping the charts there, because it's not the usual type, even the usual Brazilian film that would top the charts in the country. Usually we have lots of comedies or kind of something based on a television series, but this is not it.
So has this tapped into something that the Brazilians are looking for?
Absolutely. And I think there is a sense of pride, because there's amazing reviews from the Venice Film Festival. There's Oscar talk about the film. Of course, the nominations are coming out only in January, but some people say they will definitely be nominated for Best Foreign Film and even for Best Actress for Fernanda Torres. She is legendary, and it's funny because Brazilians know her as a comedy actress. She did a lot of kind of sitcoms in Brazil, and she's the daughter of legendary Fernanda Montenegro, which was the only Brazilian actress nominated for an Oscar in 1999. So if this happens again, it will be mother and daughter.
Now, before we came on air, you showed me your phone and you showed me the Instagram feed of the Oscars, of the Academy. Yes. And you demonstrated to me very easily the reach, the power of Brazilian cinema to Brazilians themselves. Can you explain to everybody what you showed me earlier?
I will. So at the Academy, there was an event full of amazing actors and actresses, from Nicole Kidman to Demi Moore, and Fernanda Torres was there. So they had a portrait of all those amazing people, and he got a lot of likes, if I may say, 50,000, big numbers. But when they took a picture of Fernanda Torres, it's 2.8 million likes. And that's the thing. There's something it's beautiful, but almost obsessive about Brazilians when they become proud of a famous kind of Brazilian that has done well abroad. You're playing with that big number. And some people are even saying that this number, 2.8 million that I said, could even help her chances at the Oscars. Because I think it would be a good opportunity as well to connect with, let's be honest, a big country with a big cinema industry as well.
And this leads me to my final question, which is, what is this about? Obviously, Brazilians love their own film and they're terribly proud and very excited. But when you hear about world film, Brazil doesn't necessarily always occupy a very loud and noisy position. It seems to be something that, as you have just said, it's a Brazilian thing. So what is it about Brazilian films that is sort of maybe holding it back? And what are we missing?
I hope it changes, by the way. But I do think it's because, first of all, Brazilians love comedy. And I'm not sure, Emma. I think sometimes the type of Brazilian films the Brazilians like might not travel abroad. I think Brazilian comedy might be too specific for some. And remember, we're a big country. We have a big internal market. But I have to say, I feel a wave. It's not just I'm Still Here. There are other films by amazing directors, Motel Destino by Karim Ainus, who became actually a director of foreign films as well, but then he decided to go back to Brazil to do another kind of film. So I feel something will change. Even by next year, we'll see more Brazilian films here on the screens in London or New York or Paris.
That was supposed to be my final question, but there's one thing I have to ask you, because you're a senior correspondent. So what's on the Fernando Augusto Pacheco cultural radar for this weekend?
Two things.
Okay.
Tonight I'll be dancing to bouncy French electropop here in Hackney, London. Casey Lambist, an amazing singer. I had the pleasure to interview him. He's finally here in London, so I look forward to that. And on Netflix is the release of Senna, which is a series based on the life of the Brazilian Formula One driver, who is also a national hero. And I think, as many Brazilians, I'm also a huge fan of Ayrton Senna. I want to see what they have done with it.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you. Enjoy your bounce. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producer, Anita Riotta. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The briefing's back on Monday at the same time, but for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a good weekend.